Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lino. Thank you to all the organizers for the invitation and my sincerest apologies for not being there in person. As Lino mentioned, I was poised to join. I was actually at the airport in minutes from boarding my flight, and then I had a fainting spell, which was, fine. I got lots of immediate assistance, but they don't let you board after that. So then I had to come back to Cambridge. And that is where I'm joining you from now. So my sincerest apologies. I'm really, really sad to miss out on all of the conversations and the excursions and so on, but I hope you will have a wonderful time. And thank you for bearing with me as I present my talk to you online. Okay, so where does the sea end? Now, famously, on this question, the 17th century Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius changed his mind. So in the early 1600s, in the essay Mare Liberum, or the Free Sea, Grotius argued, in fact, that the sea did not even end at the coast. It comprehended the beach up to and possibly even beyond the standard high water mark line. In other words, he argued, the sea encompassed that part of the land that was identified as the shore. Central to his argument at this time was the assertion that no part of the water, and only under very stringent conditions the shore, could be made proper. That is to say, that it could be occupied, transformed into property, and brought within the jurisdiction of the coastal sovereign. But 20 years later, by 1625, Grotius was arguing the opposite. It turned out now that some part of the water could be occupied and enclosed within the jurisdiction of the coastal sovereign. This applied, he said, to narrow bands of the sea, which the coastal sovereign could control by commanding vessels just by sitting on land. And this proposition later became clarified as the cannon shot rule, prescribing the extent to which territorial sovereignty could be extended into the sea. Now, my purpose here is not to delve into Grotius's thought and how and why it changed between the contexts of the 1600s and the 1620s. Rather, inspired by the theme of this creative and intellectually imaginative workshop, I want to make 3 points taking forward the observations from this initial anecdote. So firstly, I want to make a point about the constitutive role of the law. The question of where the sea ends, or indeed what the sea is, I would suggest must be unpacked via an understanding of the role that the law has played in defining the sea. And this is true both of the 17th century natural law of Grotius's argument or the 20th century positive law of the sea. In short, my point is that while, of course, there is a so-called real ocean out there, how we understand this ocean and engage with it is heavily determined by the law of the sea and related bodies of international law. Secondly, then, we must consider then the limits of the bodies of work that are dedicated so far to explaining and exposing this role of the law. This includes things like critical legal studies, histories of international law, and legal ordering. It's important to think about the limits of these works as they explain the ocean in order to think about what these works might become. And finally, then, having engaged the limits of the ocean and the law, I would like us to dwell on the possibilities and challenges of exploring alternative world-making possibilities. Where do we look for these and how do we explore them? How, in other words, can we participate in critical knowledge production that has the capacity to shift our understanding of beginnings and ends and the pasts and futures of the sea? So, getting started on this very slender agenda, let me go straight to my first point, which is the role of the law in constituting the sea. Now, as I said, I'm not intending to go much into Grotius, but I imagine everyone here is more than well aware that Mare Liberum, prepared on commission, as it were, from the Dutch East India Company, wasn't simply a tract spelling out freedoms of trade, navigation, and war available to the company. It was a tract that linked these freedoms to what Grotius insisted were elemental properties of the sea. So he had argued that the sea was by its nature fundamentally different from land. The sea was fluid and constantly in movement. The sea was unbounded and unboundable. The sea cohered as land did not. The sea was indivisible, no lines could be marked upon it. The sea could not be occupied, it could not be stood upon, it could not support fences. It was inexhaustible and it could not be altered by human activity. Its resources owed nothing to cultivation, and thus it could not be treated as land was, it could not be territorialized. As Grotius's own contemporaries had argued, these were chosen descriptions rather than essential features of the sea and especially of the near seas. But they proved to be influential representations with the image of an inexhaustible, unbounded, changeless sea supporting the imperial doctrine of the freedom of the sea. This image, this Grotian image of the seas, in fact, came to be widely reproduced in map-making practices from the 17th century onwards, replacing older cartographical practices that had sought to give expression to more intimately felt human-ocean relations. And such new maps, and you see here the shift from, say, the Olaus Magnus map of 1539 to the Bellin map of 1768, such new maps, together with the doctrine of freedom, became the vehicle not only for imperialism, but also, as the literary historian Isabel Hofmeyr has argued, for hiding its traces and legacies. Now, since Grotius's time, much has changed in our concept of international law. It is now derived not from nature or right reason per se, but from political acts of states that are expressed via the legal forms of treaty and customary international law. And there is a lot of this law. There are hundreds of treaties, tens of institutions, dozens of regulations, a plethora of custom, all applicable to the oceans. There is even a so-called constitution of the oceans in the form of the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, itself the outcome of a major political negotiation. However, if the basis for this new law is politics, it is not avowedly so, for what is politics without justification, which is the predication of interest-based choices upon moral claims, and the new law of the sea, as much as the old, claims its justifications on arguments from natural law, including from the elemental, from the natural properties of the sea. And yet, once again, it remakes and invents what it claims to describe and represent. So, what is the ocean that is produced by this new law of the sea? Let me show you how legal lines and juridical objects have come to occupy the sea now. So, let's start again with a Grotian map, a map of the empty ocean, which suggests that political boundaries stop at land. And let's work onwards from here to see what has changed. So, these maps show you lines of jurisdiction that have been marked in the ocean. These are now much in excess of the cannon shot rule. They enclose within the national jurisdiction of states bodies of water that are variously described as internal waters, territorial seas, archipelagic waters, continental shelves, and exclusive economic zones. So only the bits in the first map that remain sort of light gray, the bits that remain gray in both maps can now be seen as areas that are beyond national jurisdiction. This map, these two maps then show you areas of the sea that are within the high seas or the deep sea bed that are also now enclosed. So one map shows you parts of the ocean that are enclosed within fisheries regimes and within marine protected areas. And these areas are, of course, set to expand with the entry into force of the recent agreement on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, colloquially called the High Seas Treaty. The other map shows you areas of the seabed that are under contracts of exploration by companies, and there are 31 such contracts that have been given out. And as you can see with the red circles that I've drawn on those maps, that they enclose quite a large part of the seabed beyond national jurisdiction. These maps show you ships, they show you map shipping routes, and they also try to show you the density of international shipping. And of course, we had a pretty good idea of the density of international shipping a few years ago when the ship Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal and caused a huge backup, a huge traffic jam. These maps a slightly dated map of submarine cables. And the second map is a map, again, a slightly dated map of plastics in the ocean. In fact, the problem has gotten much worse since then. But what the plastics map shows you, every little white dot on that map shows you 20 kilograms of plastic. And in some places, you can see there is so much plastic that it is even argued that it is coagulating into what are called trash islands. And then there are not maps, but there are legal provisions that essentially speak to how we can treat artifacts of erased histories. So there are no maps that can mark the grave sites of the Atlantic slave trade. There are no maps that mark the intangible and metaphysical associations that Polynesian seafarers have had with the oceans. These, unfortunately, are reduced in legal in international law to definitions to having for to these to communities affected by both the slave trade or by the reduction of the erasure of the Polynesian imaginary, to being asked to identify essentially particular objects and artifacts that can be marked as tangible cultural heritage and be protected in those respects. So there are no maps for this. These are not seen as occupying large spaces of the sea. These are now just they are reduced to the sense that there may be a few sites that can be earmarked as of particular relevance to Pacific peoples or to formerly enslaved peoples, and be protected in those terms. Now, I could continue to keep showing you more maps, but what I want to do here is just put some of the maps I've shown you together to see what we get. And here, if you will excuse the bad photoshopping, I hope what you will see is the image of what we might think of as an extremely crowded ocean. So quite different from the empty ocean of Grotius's description, an ocean that is now crowded, completely occupied by human presence. Yet look through the mess, and the crowded ocean is also a heavily simplified ocean. So what the new law of the sea has done is that by using a series of simple thumb rules, it has neatly filleted ocean space and all that it contains. Thus, under the new law of the sea, under the 20th century law of the sea, the ocean is divided by zone, by medium, and by function. And these divisions rest on arguments of the ocean's nature. So the divisions rest on naturalistically defined distance rules that claim to represent the natural extent of the continental shelf, the natural expanse of archipelagic waters, the natural accumulation of fishing grounds, and so forth. The distinctions rest on the supposedly natural distinction between mediums, between solid and liquid, or land and sea. So you have different regimes that apply to seabeds and sea waters. Yet this is, as we know, a distinction that is confounded in many different parts of the sea, from polar regions to hydrothermal vents. And then there are distinctions that rest on the functional specifications of the supposedly natural places that different objects occupy in the ocean. And thus, various things are identified as just sitting here or there, with these choices being sometimes quite specious. And to give you some examples, corals are treated as belonging to the seabed, when in fact we know corals grow in the water and even breach the surface of the sea, and yet they're treated as objects that belong to the seafloor. Crustaceans are treated as objects that do not swim, that are sedentary, that do not swim. But anyone that has seen a prawn or a shrimp will know that that is not true. And things like hydrothermal vents are not addressed at all, because they confound all these distinctions. They confound not only distinctions between things that stay still and things that move, between solid and liquid mediums, but also distinctions between life and matter, being places where matter continuously quickens into life. So the divisions enacted by the law transform the ocean from delicate and interconnected ecosystems into essentially discrete sites of economic activity. The law, as I said before, fillets the ocean, removing pesky complications that might interfere with our sense of what kinds of use its various parts are good for. And the law even thickens the notion of what is that it of exploitation by associating it with the notion of the good. So many legal doctrines demand things like optimum use. They worry about the underutilization of fisheries, and they link exploitation to things like realizing the principle of the seabed as the common heritage of mankind. And I'll say a bit more about that later. For now, let's take stock of the similarities between contemporary law and the Grotian law. Now, on the surface, things could not be more different. The one was a doctrine of freedom that represented the ocean as an indivisible and cohering whole. The other is a complex legal architecture that divides up the ocean by zone, medium, and function, and is replete with instructions on the appropriate modes of using different parts of the sea. Yet looked at closely and through the prism of the current perils that confront the ocean, you know these very well, things like warming waters, rising waters, plastic coagulations, acidification, biodiversity loss, fish stocks collapse, geopolitical tensions. Looked at closely through all of these factors, I think a picture of continuity emerges. So here again, we have an ocean made safe for imperialism, for exploitation at the hands of a very few, with huge threat to those at its receiving end, which is the peoples and the communities and the fragile sovereignties of the global south. Now, I understand that what is a southern state today is really a question, as states like India and China have become part of the new imperial matrix. But when I talk about the fragile sovereignties of the global south, I have in mind states like the small Pacific island states, which are facing the threat of loss of statehood as they sink underwater, or states like Palestine that are still struggling for international recognition. We might think about the features that remain common across the old law and this one. And there are three features I think that we could identify. So the first is the persistence of extractivism, the old and the new laws of the sea, through their different formal structures, have been oriented and remain oriented towards maximizing extraction of the ocean's natural resources. We also have then, both in the old law and in the new, a cloaking of imperialism. So both the old law of the sea and the new are good at hiding away traces of imperialism, not only in terms of visual depiction, but also, as I said before, by linking large-scale extraction with the realization of the common good. And both the old law and the new law have been very good at representing problems, the problems ranging from piracy to pollution, as problems of lawlessness, when in fact, the truth might lie in the opposite, in the lawfulness of oppressive and exploitative relations on the sea. So, my short point here is, I hope, a very familiar one. We live in a time when it is tempting to link progressive politics to the defense of law and legal institutions, to the defense, so to speak, of the rule of law, and this is understandable. But it is important not to lose sight of the ways in which the laws and legal institutions that we have, the global governance that we have, may be part of the problem. So the question may not be whether we need more law or new law, but the question may be, what law are we looking for? From here, I'd like to move to my second point, which is on the limits of current legal inquiries. So given that the story of the ocean that I've told you so far can be told as one of constitution by law and to the detriment of the ocean, how far do these facts find expression in work that seeks to expose and explain the law? And the answer, I think, would be, unfortunately, not very far. The fields of legal critique, including critical international legal studies, critical international legal history, suffer from what is often called a sea blindness. And this is also the case for major parts of other related disciplines and indeed of institutional accounts of major world transformations. So here again, you have, interestingly, maps that the UN used to use to depict the process of decolonization. And as you can see, again, it tries to show a picture of a change, a picture of a world moving from one of empires to one of nation states, but leaves in both maps the ocean exactly as it was. The ocean is seemingly unchanged, an example of blindness to changes in the sea. But similarly, you could scan through major works of critical legal scholarship and find scant mention of the sea, let alone of the large body of the law of the sea. And this is a point that I had made a few years ago to legal scholars. I'd expected quite a lot of pushback, but as it happened, there was none. And last year, Anthony Angie, the founding father, the sort of leading scholar and historian of third world approaches to international law, made the point again in his retrospective of the work that critical legal scholarship has done in exposing the work that different bodies of law do. And the same, I would say, would be true also of major governance, international, and political histories more broadly. So, on the slide before you, I've put examples of some leading works that have actually been major in their fields, that are works that are read across fields, and yet works where you would have to squeeze really hard to find any reference to the oceans or the law of the sea. This includes, and perhaps most hauntingly, the final work, Timothy Mitchell's Carbon Democracy, which is on questions of materiality. It asks you to think about where oil is located, and yet does not think about the fact that so much oil is located offshore, and does not think about what that has meant in terms of the construction of the legal architecture of the law of the sea. I think it's probably in mainstream legal scholarship that we would find the most engagement with the sea. There is voluminous scholarship on the law of the sea, but the thrust of this work tends to be doctrinal. The questions it asks is simply what is the law and how has the law developed over time, but it pays very little attention to context. The treatment of Grotius again is telling here. So Grotius is, of course, a major figure for lawyers and law students who do know that they should associate him not just with the very more famous De Jure Belli Ac Passis, the book of 1625, but also with his initial work on the law of the sea, including the tract Mare Liberum. Yet the context of his doctrines, the basis of Mare Liberum in the links to the Dutch East India Company and the need to justify Dutch imperial enterprise, these links continue to catch law students by surprise. And it hardly helps that even in cognate disciplines, it is a very particular version of Grotius that generally takes center stage. So these disciplines will talk about the political theorist of natural rights, the virtuous humanist who was capable of heterodoxy, while the wily and innovative young lawyer who was writing on retainer from a major global corporation, that version of him takes the background. And thus, the doctrine of the freedom of the sea gets hardly interrogated and is linked at all, if at all, to a context of virtue. And this then furthers in legal literature a variety of tendencies that are quite problematic. On the one hand, we have contributionist literature, for example, in the work of C.H. Alexandrovich, the distinguished Polish jurist of Madras, who argued that the free sea doctrine was also one that was practiced in the Indian Ocean much before the arrival of the Europeans, making, in other words, a sort of we too had a kind of argument, we too had international law. This is problematic for various reasons. On the other hand, the embrace of the doctrine stops us short of critical assessment of the categories through which we could understand how what we call the freedom of the sea is in fact a highly unequal distribution of privileges and constraints, with rapacious global corporations able to routinely claim the freedom of the sea for their activities, while acts of even small-scale resistance get branded as terrorism or piracy. There are important limits to recognize also within the much smaller number of works that do engage with the sea and its resources and do examine the politics or political economy of the architecture of ocean governance. I think these works are very important. They are essential in making us interrogate the things we usually take as given, such as the artifice in the boundaries drawn between the licit and the illicit, the public and the private, between land and sea, etc. However, the trend of these works, I think, has been tightly focused on the North, on northern actors, predicaments, machinations, and northern domestic drivers of international action. The North, in other words, is given context. But what about the South? The South, that is to say, the historically subordinated polities and communities of Asia, Africa, Oceania, and Latin America, and fourth worlds everywhere, these tend to get flattened. They are made into a few categories of passive objects of global regimes, categories of elite compradors helping along extractive northern projects, and categories of irrational and irrelevant but dangerous revolutionaries. Now, obviously, there may be Southern actors who can be accurately placed in all of these categories. But how is it that the critiques that have long been made by third world Marxists, people like Walter Rodney, or by the Subaltern Study School, people like Ranajit Guha, how can it be that these critiques, 40, 50 years old at least, still hold true? How is it that too little attention remains paid in our universal, global, international, and similarly capaciously claimed histories and theories of law and political economy and global order to the majority world? And that how is it that especially taking Southern actors as agents within structures, as intellectual innovators and drivers of practical political action, as world makers, still remains a marginal and developing field of inquiry. A number of unfortunate consequences follow, I think, from this effacement of the global South. The most crucial for my purposes is that it affects how we understand the role of law, how we understand the trajectories of legal regimes, and even the conditions of possibility for pursuing progressive politics through legal forms and legal fora. So let me illustrate here with an example that I have studied for a long time, seabed mining, and the efforts to articulate a legal framework around seabed mining, that is to say, a legal framework to govern the exploitation of the critical minerals of the deep seabed. To show you what I mean. So this deep seabed, the area beyond national jurisdiction, has been designated in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and the Constitution of the Oceans as the common heritage of humankind, and is the subject of a detailed regime for seabed mining that is overseen by a dedicated international institution, the International Seabed Authority. Formally, the International Seabed Authority is charged with ensuring that seabed mining should be conducted for the common benefit of all mankind, which includes developing states, peoples, and future generations. In practice, what this means has remained completely up for grabs, with the meaning of common benefit shifting majorly over time. So the idea of common benefit had once indicated goals of common participation in seabed mining and common administration of seabed mining, together with equitable distribution of all revenue generated from seabed mining. This was reduced over time to just the question of the distribution of some revenue with no common participation and no equality and administration. This was then further reduced in more recent times to arguments that merely ensuring the recovery of critical minerals is enough because it aids the green transition, and that corporations should in fact be rewarded for recovering these minerals rather than have to redistribute the revenue obtained. Most recently, as for example, in the US executive order that President Trump issued in April 2025, it is now argued that seabed mining may not even be a matter for international policy at all, but for the go it alone programs and for rivalrous domestic action of various blood states. So, in other words, the doctrine of common heritage of mankind has had a very grand name, but it has been in retreat in terms of its substantive promise almost from the moment of its introduction in the 1960s and early 70s. But to illustrate my point now, what kinds of accounts do we get of this doctrine? And here we get a range of problematic accounts. So in many critical legal interventions, such as in third world approaches to international law or on work that looks at the movement for a new international economic order, there's no mention at all. These works, as I said before, just tend to ignore the sea. In mainstream accounts, we get a bland progress narrative, which runs from this idea of the discovery of the seabed as an object of governance to the suggestion of the culmination in the mere acceptance of the phrase common heritage of mankind of an amazingly communitarian idea. So these accounts will often be in the vein of, look at what an incredible doctrine we've managed to adopt. It was such a huge success for international law's evolving promise. It was so hard to accomplish this. We had to walk such hard roads. It was such a tough negotiation, but we overcame, and now we have this wonderful sounding doctrine. You get the picture. Within the handful of sort of sea-facing critical works, we get the kind of north-facing narrative, north-focused or north-facing narrative that I mentioned. So either that the seabed regime was initially a third world victory, which was later undone by neoliberalism, or perhaps that it was undone from the start, but with figures like Kissinger, Reagan, and Thatcher being the main characters of the story. And this is fine. I think this is good analysis. But what gets left out is attention to what was in fact erased and reduced and undone. What was the South stance on seabed mining, and how can we illuminate it as an economic idea, as a much fought for blueprint, and as a struggle connected to yet other struggles and theaters of anti-colonial activity? To not ask these questions, to not ask what was the South seeking, what was its intellectual, its programmatic vision of seabed mining, what were the efforts that it made to translate its visions into effective political, economic, and policy programs is really then to evaluate a doctrine with only half the context, without a clear understanding of what one whole side of a struggle was seeking from it. In this way, I would say our accounts tend to erase the very possibilities that are articulated in such visions of what law and governance could be, visions of other epistemologies that are and can and should feed into the making of visions of global governance today. And by the way, I don't want to press this too much, but we might stop and think about the rise of some kinds of new critical schools that press disconnection and disenchantment with the world, with modernity and with law. Discourses, for example, of decoloniality, of Afro-pessimism, as possibly linked to this persistent methodological denial of anti-colonialism as programmatic intellection and as world making. And this is the point that third world Marxists like Vijay Prashad and Kevin Okoth have recently made. Now, I have told you so far that we need to recognize the ocean as legally constituted, that the law consolidates an extractive imaginary of the sea, that critical inquiries into the law obscure or ignore rather than reveal what is erased in the processes of such legal constitution, and in particular that they erase the world-making projects of the South, and that this severely constrains any broader future-oriented imagination of the ocean and of the law. So my final point follows rather obviously that we do need to look into Southern world making and also into the possibilities and limits of such scholarly investigations. So here I'm putting my cards on the table. I'm going to tell you about a project that I'm starting in the hope that I might get some feedback from you. And for this, again, I'm really sorry that I can't actually be there to talk to everyone in person. But if you have any thoughts or suggestions or advice for me, please feel free to reach out also via email, or if you want to chat about things in general, I would be most happy to do that. So the project I am describing is going to be called Ways of World Making, the Global South and the Reimagination of Global Ocean Governance. And it's received some funding recently. The project takes as its starting point the various perils that confront us today, perils that you might call the Anthropocene or the climate crisis or the polycrisis or whatever term you choose, but that these perils have opened up the ocean once again as a site of struggle over the shape of the future. So the crises themselves have unsettled the 20th century constitutional consensus that was represented by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And now we have very big, new, very extractive, quite tragic blue economy visions of major states and regions jostling for space, not just within given legal architectures, but also cutting against them. This is interestingly, therefore, a moment of flux. And as a moment of flux, it shares features with a previous moment. That is the moment of the 1960s and 70s, when the Cold War, decolonization, technological change, and political mobilizations had created the conditions for some kinds of imaginative world making that was very much within the constraints of extractivism and developmentalism, but at least had much thinking about appropriate political economic approaches. And this was especially so in the third world states, which had tried to sort out different mixed economy experiments between capitalism and communism for themselves. In the present, things are both the same and they are different. So many key states have these grand but hardly novel or radical visions of how to think about the sea. And as I said before, even states like India or China, the former mavericks of the Cold War, are now in politico-economic terms at the end of history in their inability to think beyond growth and capitalism. But the question my project hopes to explore is what space has this jostling between the given international order and the big extractive visions of these states? What space has this jostling opened up for groups, collectivities, and movements to advance their own distinctive visions of the nature and the future of the ocean? So, put another way, the project seeks to explore the coming together of different ocean publics and their intellectual production in the context of practical political action vis-a-vis the ocean. The commitments of the project are to develop ways of reading the range of texts and artifacts that are produced by varied ocean publics as world making, which means attention, unsurprisingly, to how we do our work in jurisprudence, political thought, and intellectual history, and also efforts positive efforts to recast interventions by different modes in different contexts and at diverse scales of production as engagements with global ocean governance. So there are obvious challenges here. There are obvious challenges to doing work like this. There are prior questions like what is a world-making text? How can we pick up one action and redefine it as acting on a much grander scale than it itself seems to think it is? What skills do we need to identify and read different texts? There are the usual challenges of building something interdisciplinary, including the resistance of some disciplines, including, I suppose, some of the disciplines like yours, to the work of abstraction, generalization, and recasting that is the material of legal work, of governance work, where this kind of work is routinely done. But of course, other disciplines rightly have much concern about these processes. And then there are, of course, broader questions of who should do this work and how should we stage this work. So there are questions about whether there are too many tensions baked into a project that is, on the one hand, about law and global order, on the other hand, seeks to draw on very particular and diverse locales, that seeks to connect past and present and the concrete and the normative in very fluid ways. And I'm more than happy to discuss all of this. But here I want to close with a story that to me illuminates the biggest challenge of all. And that is of the likelihood, after all of this work might be done, after we spend time figuring out different modes of world making, different world making visions, how to translate local actions to global interventions, and so forth, the danger is of the likelihood of the subsumption of all intervention into bland processes of inclusion and of the reception of what might be political engagements as merely aesthetic ones. So put simply, while our legal regimes may be in flux, while there may be this opportunity open to jostle for new world-making visions, is the problem again that this is not, none of this flux is as fundamental as we might need for any of this work to matter. In other words, we can have different visions of the blue economy, but not really questions about extractivism or capitalism per se. And so here's the story I want to tell you. And again, it is a story in the context of seabed mining. So as you will have heard, while on the one hand, major efforts are ongoing to sort of get it going. There are these 31 exploration contracts. The International Seabed Authority is hard at work on finishing its exploitation regulations to allow commercial recovery of minerals to begin. There is also rising criticism on environmental grounds. Seabed mining, it turns out, will be very bad for the oceans. It will be very bad for climate. It could create a massive release of carbon. It will certainly add to ocean pollution. And so there has been for some years now a push by various environmental actors for a moratorium, for a pause on seabed mining to allow time for further study of the seabed to find out if there are sustainable pathways to seabed mining. And as part of this push, in 2023, one environmental actor, Greenpeace, arranged to bring leaders of some Pacific indigenous communities to the International Seabed Authority to present their opposition. This was seen as important because many Pacific Island states, in their severely constrained predicaments where they are facing existential threats, have actually embraced seabed mining as a source of revenue for their economies. So it was thought important to bring leaders of indigenous communities from within these states to actually say, no, this is not something we want. We don't want seabed mining. We want a stop on it, a moratorium. We support that idea. So a number of Pacific indigenous leaders were brought by Greenpeace on the Greenpeace ship, the Arctic Sunrise. It landed in Jamaica, in Kingston, Jamaica, which is where the headquarters of the International Seabed Authority are located. And the landing itself had great symbolic significance. The arriving indigenous leaders were greeted by the Jamaican Maroons. Jamaican Maroons are descendants of people who had escaped plantation slavery and set up their own sovereign communities in the 17th and 18th centuries. And so they met each other in a sort of major gesture of Fourth World solidarity. In fact, the indigenous leaders took permissions from the Maroons to come on to the soil of Jamaica. They were granted these permissions, and then there was a sort of singing and dancing celebration as the peoples met and mingled. Then the indigenous leaders went the next day to the International Seabed Authority, and at the assembly of the International Seabed Authority, they performed an Oli, which is a Hawaiian chant form, which offered the consciousness of the Pacific Ocean as the Mare Nostrum, as the sea of the Pacific peoples, and described it in the terms that Ipeli Hauofa had once very beautifully laid out, explaining that the ocean was a place both physical and metaphysical, that it was linked to the histories, traditions, and cultures of Pacific indigenous peoples, and therefore it exceeded the connections with tangible parts of the ocean, with tangible lines or jurisdictions or artifacts. And after having explained the Pacific connection to the ocean, the indigenous leaders submitted a petition for a ban on seabed mining. Now, this was very significant. This was pushing for something much more than the moratorium that was being sought by the environmental movement. They were asking not for a pause, not for time to study whether seabed mining could be done sustainably. They were saying that actually this idea of seabed mining is not in accordance with the Pacific view of the ocean, and we therefore want a ban on this activity. Now, this intervention at the time was received as historic. There was lots of chatter about it on social media. People called it a game changer. They said this was amazing. It was this very moving. People talked about having goosebumps, about having tears in their eyes when the Pacific leaders made their intervention, and so on. But what has been the outcome? And here is the problem of subsumption. So the work on the mining code continues. Now there is a new working group on cultural heritage, and Pacific peoples, Pacific indigenous leaders have been asked to identify some key sites within the seabed that are of tangible importance to them, that are sites of tangible cultural heritage, so that those can be protected. But the idea of the sea itself as the intangible cultural heritage of Pacific peoples, that idea is seen as not workable because obviously that would cut too much against the idea of seabed mining. So the indigenous leaders who came to the International Seabed Authority were first given the burden of translation. They had to explain their own concepts, their own associations with the sea in terms of what that might mean in terms of juridical concepts, in terms of the kind of juridical action that they were seeking. And now they've been faced with the burden of accommodation to the regime as it is. So again, there has been a subsumption of their intervention. Their political action, in fact, has been reduced to something that was moving, to something that was very ornamental. And this is what I mean by the reduction of politics to mere aesthetics. And there can be many such examples that we could think of, which has also contributed to the kind of ennui that critical legal scholars have often expressed, where they say, well, what will happen anyway? Doesn't renewal always just repeat the old? Are there really any emancipatory possibilities from law and by law under capitalism, with the obvious implication being no? So this is an important challenge. It is also that people, in the end, it seems like we just fling our hands up and say, well, what is the possibility here? I don't really have a real answer to this question to say, no, this is not the right way to think about it, or that we have to continue to engage with law and legal institutions. But I do want to remind you, perhaps use as the aid memoir, the very famous question that Lenin had once asked, and to use that as a basis for asking you for your thoughts. So we know the problems of the ocean. We know that these are problems of scale. They require action at scale. We know that they require essentially re-understanding the nature and the future of the ocean. We know the challenges of subsumption. And so then to ask you Lenin's question, what is to be done? Thank you.